20 minutes, and I'm gonna try to cover about 10 years of works and projects from the early test I was doing and early experiments in 2005 up to now, where I'm doing a lot of different things, from architectural projections, installations, and smaller works in galleries. It took me a few years to realize why I was so interested in video projection, and I think that sentence kind of sums it up. What I like about projection and projection mapping and all the technique I use is just using the light itself as a medium and the space as a canvas, as opposed to just projecting on a rectangular screen. So all the works you're gonna see are mostly all kind of based on this idea of using light in space. I guess it all started when I moved to Bristol in the UK in 2004. I was doing graphic design, and then I had a lot of free time in my hands, so I started doing VJing in clubs, bought a projector off eBay and started doing things. I didn't really know what VJing was, so I kind of improvised a lot. My first VJ show was a PowerPoint slideshow, which is like level 0 of interactive visuals or VJing. And a couple of years after doing intensive VJing, I was in my bedroom doing some experiments, and I realized that with a single video projector, instead of projecting onto a screen, I could project at anything and use anything three-dimensional as a canvas for projection. And I was like, wow, maybe I invented something. This is amazing. I can turn a piece of paper into something that emits light. And I later found that I didn't really invent anything. You probably know the work of Michael Neymar, that I believe was presenting some work here last year. And he was already doing projection mapping in the 80s. So filming a room, a colored room, and then reprojecting the color after painting it white. And it's also a moving projection, so it's kind of interactive projection mapping. So yeah, I really didn't invent anything. But anyway, I didn't know it at the time. I was like so excited, so I spent hours and hours trying stuff, trying different materials, different canvases. Paper is really easy to fold and to use and to play with. So I started making these collage and these compositions out of just folded paper. And the more elements I would add, the more I realized I was fascinated about geometry and patterns. And that's something you will also see in all my work. Repetitive patterns and the connection between patterns and nature is something I'm always fascinated about. I started using different tools to do real-time projection mapping. So I started coding at about the same time, 2006, 2007. I was using Adobe Flash at the time, which actually was really convenient for projection mapping. There was no tool around, and you could use vectors. You could do little action script stuff to automate the production process. So this is all Adobe Flash. And then I did further experiments, also by always mixing traditional mediums and drawings. So in this case, I did this kind of improvised performance in a club where I would paint the wall and then projection map some content when the painting was done. So yeah, this was about 10 years ago, and I still pretty much do the same thing now. Triangles, paint, and drawings. At the time, I realized there were other artists also interested in going away from the rectangular screen. And together we founded AntiVJ. We were very much inspired by music labels such as Raster Noton. And we wanted to have a common group, like a label with different artists represented by the label. We started doing a lot of installations, building geometrical sculptures, doing a lot of iterations and testing things, basically. We were not really sure what we were doing, but it was really exciting to build wooden cubes and light them up. It was just almost like magic for us at the time. Thanks to the internet, we got a lot of exposure with our blog and our website, and we started doing large-scale projection. I'm going to skip through because we did so many of them, especially in 2008, 2009. We were doing about one project a month. And again, at the beginning, we were just experimenting. So we realized we could change the way a building looks like. We realized we could remodel a building and move the windows and change the balcony. And we could morph the architecture and change the way the audience looks at the architecture. And it's almost a way to change reality. It's just the perception of the reality. But it was a really amazing feeling at the time. We experimented with what has since became very cliche effects, like we would make things explode and fall down, and we would push the bricks, and with no actual meaning in the first years. But then, after a couple of gigs, we realized that maybe we could go further than the explosion and the kind of easy effects. One of the key moments was when we got commissioned to do a project on this building, which arguably looks horrible. It's not really sexy. So when we got the proposal, we were like, oh, that's not so exciting. But Romain Tardy, who is also part of AntiVJ, directed this project and turned this building into some sort of fantastical clockwork machine. And we realized how strong, how powerful that medium of light could be. When you try to go, we still used FX, but from that point on, we started writing storyboards and asking ourselves, oh, maybe we can write stories, maybe we can develop something with that new medium. This project was our first project in Asia, in South Korea. We were commissioned for the opening of this building, which is part of New Songdo City. A city based on technology with RFIDs to open doors and eye scanning to enter your house and everything. You can't really do anything in this city without an ID or without technology. So we then thought about the importance of the technology and the code and the computer in the social experience we would have in this city, and we developed a piece about the idea of what if there's a glitch in that big computer that rules the city? What if you can't no longer access your home, and what happens if the technology takes over, basically? So it was interesting for us at the time because we would never get like briefs or direction for the works, because people who commissioned us, they didn't really know what we were doing, so we had carte blanche. So it was really amazing to have that freedom of doing whatever we wanted. For this project, for Mutek, we tried to tell the story of this tower called La Tour des Convoyeurs. There was a twin tower exactly the same on the next pier that has been demolished in the 80s. So we tried to reproject on this tower a kind of ghost image of the other tower, and we tried to kind of connect the architecture and the history with light. We also started working a lot with heritage and castles and cathedrals. And once again, when you have the opportunity to work with such an exciting canvas, then we did pay a lot more attention to the content, the storyboard, the story we would tell. We realized it was an interesting way to go through history and tell the story of the city of Breda, in this case, which burned down once, and then the organ was dismantled twice in its story. So we did a lot of research and tried to get inspired by the architecture and the building itself for the content. This project, Omicron, was directed by Romain Tardy and Thomas Vaquier. This is a silent presentation, by the way, but the work of Thomas has been amazing and really made our projects much better than they actually are. Like, the sound really brings that kind of magical element. This is a permanent project, so if you ever go to Wrocław in Poland, you can visit this place. There would be thousands of things to say about this. We kind of got away from the classic storyboard here, and it was more Romain Tardy made an homage to sci-fi movies and this kind of brutal architecture from Marksberg. This was the biggest dome to date. At the time, it was built in 1903, I believe, and we spent a week mapping each of these poles, and yeah, I should probably, I have so many things to say, but this was amazing. 70 meters high, 40 meters high building. I'm going to skip through. With AntiVJ, we did a lot of stage design and visuals for musicians and DJs, and that was a very exciting format as well, but it's so much work to produce a 1 hour long show. Really requires months and months of work, so that's something we tend to do less. We did this project with Flying Lotus back in 2011, and really exciting project, and I was directing it, and I think I got too overwhelmed by the idea of working with him. So I wanted to use lasers, DMX, sound reactive, projection mapping on a background thing, real-time stuff, everything, and it was a little bit too much for the experience I had at the time. So it was okay, but I learned from that experience that being too ambitious with only 2 months of production can be a little tricky. So part of what I do now with my studio, we're based in Brussels, by the way, and the main thing that we do is installations. This is a project I did in Montreal, in a dome, part of this place called La Sat, and really exciting display with 360 projections and immersive sound. And this is I guess the first time I started really trying to develop narratives around geometry, architecture, and cosmos, which are now my main interest in all the projects we do. This project Blueprint tried to explore this idea of the connection between geometry and the cosmos, and it was the beginning of my obsession with monolith, and it's going to be obvious in the next few slides. This is a bit intense, but these are excerpts of the piece, where it goes from two-dimensional patterns to the emergence of structures and architecture and human architecture and cosmos patterns. A tricky thing when you run a studio is to find a way to be sustainable and to not only do one-off projects, because when you do projection mapping on a facade, you're not going to get twice the same facade, so you have to start the project, work for 3 or 4 months, do the show, which sometimes lasts for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and then you have to find the next building and start over again. So it was exciting in the first few years, but now I really want to develop an idea on a longer term and ideally over the years. So this is why I started doing different iterations of the same idea. So Blueprint was first created as an installation, and then we made this live performance at Sonar Festival, which is exactly the same idea, the same narratives, but just with a different form. This was another iteration of Blueprint, this time again in a cathedral, and where I took the same content, added some 3D scans of this particular cathedral in Paris, and then we used the floor and the tiles as a canvas for light as well. I'm skipping through a lot of things, so I hope it's not too much and too unrelated, but I hope it will make sense by the end as well. So yeah, again, amazing to work in such environments. We all started with AntiVJ in clubs, all the way to cathedrals, and it's interesting to see, especially in Europe, many of the cathedrals are no longer being used, or then the religious beliefs not being what they were a century ago. Now the places have a second life, and there are cultural institutes taking over, or getting access to the cathedrals and being able to organize events in these places, which I found very interesting. Again, like my obsession for the monolith, this time at Art Basel Miami a couple of years ago. This kind of connects to my gallery work that I'm going to show you next. Again, I'm exploring different patterns and how we perceive reality, and trying to change the way this facade looks only by using light and specific contrast and content to just try to change the way people perceive the city around them. That brings me to wall drawings. You might have seen one behind you. I'm going to show you a couple of the pieces we've done lately. I was massively inspired by Sol LeWitt, obviously, who the first conceptual artist that really, really obsessed me. I can't explain why, but I'm so obsessed by all of his work and trying to collect every single book and to understand deeper what he meant and how he developed his pieces. I love the fact that in some of his wall drawings and some of the instructions, there's also a sense of coding. Like some of the conceptual pieces are just a set of instructions. There's a weird glitch in the video signal. Is there anything I can do here? Nope. You get anything? But yeah, you all know Sol LeWitt, and he's been an amazing inspiration over the years. Let's see if... Okay. My work is so visual that if I don't have a visual element to describe things, I'm going to be a bit clueless. All right. No? Any questions so far? Oh, wow. I'm not even sure where to start. One of the things I love is the fact that the work itself is not necessarily the physical aspect, the physical element. It's more a concept. So the idea of giving the work being a set of instructions, and the idea of the work being the ability to reproduce the work, to move it across and to preserve it over time is just amazing. We struggle in digital art to resolve these questions of how do you do the conservation of the work? How do you make sure that the hardware and the software will still be there in 5-10 years' time? I struggle to run some of my works because they were meant to run on XP, and I no longer have an XP machine. Anyway, Sol LeWitt has this amazing thing. His work will last forever, even after the human mankind is gone, because the instructions are there, and technically they can be reproduced exactly like he wanted, because he managed to extract the essence of his work and to document it in such a minimalistic way as well. So yeah, he's a huge inspiration, and the fact that his work is some of his work is instruction-based as well informs a lot of what creative coders do now, and how we try to document and describe the work. I think there's a lot to learn from him. Any other question? I love the work of James Turrell. Obviously, just the physical connection that is there when you see his work, and yeah, it's really hard to describe. It's very visual. It's also intangible. You can take pictures, but you can't reproduce the artwork if you're not in the room, if you're not in the space. And that's also an amazing way to solve the question of copyright, and it's easy to reproduce some paintings and some drawings, but you can't really reproduce a James Turrell piece. It's so much about the quality of the light, the quality of the type of light frequency you use, that there's something embodied in his work, in his installations, that I'm really fascinated about. I also struggle to describe his work. It's so simple but so complex at the same time. It's such a fine-tuning between the materials in the space, the ambient light, all these variables that he mastered over the years to present us sometimes just a room with a hole, or just a room with light. And amazing, thank you. No idea what happened. I told you when I have to use a projector, it goes wrong. Present. Thank you, Barry and Kai, by the way, cool. So yeah, the wall drawings I've been working on are very different from the Sol LeWitt pieces in the way that many of them are figurative. They represent nature, they represent topologies. They also have this in common that they are geometry based. Like to generate this landscape, I used just a grid and created elevations, and all you see is generative. I got the inspiration from a trip to the Fujiyama Mount, and we did this residency 3 years ago when I was actually asked to show this other piece called Eyjafjalla Jökull, the unpronounceable name. And this piece was created in 2010 during the famous eruption that grounded all the plains. And we were asked to show this piece so many times that when we got offered this residency in Japan, really wanted to make a new iteration of the work and a kind of second chapter where it's basically a drawing with a marker pen on a wall, and then it's augmented with light. And so really simple visual elements, but I wanted to keep it minimal and simple, and then try to develop the narratives. It's inspired by the story of Kaguya Hime, which is the oldest popular tale in Japan. It's from the 10th century, and that was the starting point of this project. It was the story of the princess Kaguya Hime. And I gotta make it shorter, says Juliet, my producer. Here we go. So I'm going to scroll through all these iterations of wall drawings. It's also really fun to make something that has physicality, because we often get a bunch of helpers and we spend 3-4 days in a space just tracing lines that are being projected by the video projector. So it's kind of nice to be away from the computer from time to time. And it really gets contemplative and almost hypnotizing when you do something repetitive for a few days. And I like to think that it gets you into this sort of trance that maybe the installers of the Sol-Lewitt school might experience similar moments. This is kind of reverse mapping. It's kind of projection mapping for the lazy, because all the content is created before I get on site. And then the visual element, the real drawing, is then applied to the wall, and it fits the content. So it's kind of reverse mapping, which is the opposite of a building, obviously, because you can't really change the building. Or I'm going to scroll through. So this is I also discovered anamorphosis around this time, and I like the idea of playing around with perception again and recreating space when there is none. So this is just a corner of two walls, obviously, and then with light, I'm trying to make this kind of low poly crystal pop out and mess around with perception. This brings me to the last wall drawing I'm going to show you. This is Juliet, who's going to talk in a minute and explain the kind of how the studio works and how and why we do these projects. This piece is called La Montagne. There were too much detail and too many lines to trace, so we experimenting with different materials, with printed paper, with vinyl, and other things. And this was presented in Brussels a few months ago. And then again, the wall drawing is augmented by the light. But if the projector is off, if there's no projection, the piece is still there. And that's a common point in all my works. It's always a physical object and a layer of light that kind of tells a story and develops narratives. This was the first iteration of Pantheism, the piece that is right behind you. And I'm gonna make it short. Now, the most recent work, I guess, is the smaller pieces, the gallery works. Working with architecture is super exciting. The scale of it make it really, like, any projection is really impressive and really strong, but there's so much production to get to the point where you can project on the building. You need to get technical team, expensive projectors, etc., etc. So working on a much smaller scale allowed me to develop the same idea, express the same questions or the similar things, but with a lot less production hassle. So I've been experimenting a lot with laser cutting. This is a UV print on a LCD screen, where I'm exploring the same idea behind Pantheism. and tracing the connections between mountains, rock, and at another scale, the geometry of the cosmos. I realized that making it's hard to go through all this in a short amount of time. Working with galleries also was an opportunity for me to try different materials. This is my first try at making porcelain cubes. You might recognize some of the really early works, and I tried to scale down the geometry and the sculpture to a tinier scale, and these are porcelain cubes that I'm projection mapping. Last summer, we had a chance to go to Japan again and do this residency with a glass artist, and we spent 2 weeks with him crafting little objects, and he made these pyramids out of glass that were a very interesting canvas to project on. Another projection on glass. We also had a go at how we could use wood and engrave things in wood and try to extract pattern from wooden blocks. We'd really love to develop these ideas further, but we have limited access to machines and CNCs. We are planning on meeting with Autodesk at Pier 9 later on, and I really hope we could do something with them. On a slightly bigger scale, this is an installation we did a couple of years back for Barney's, New York. It's very rare that we do commercial projects, but this was a collaboration with Jay-Z, so I just couldn't say no. And it was a carte blanche, so we could do anything. There was no products in the windows, so that was the exception. And we did this project with the help of Kyle McDonald, who helped us design this structure and CNC it, and we used it. It's just a CNC cut foam structure covered with mirrors. It took us days and days just to apply the mirrors one by one. Yeah, that brings me to the upcoming projects, the most recent things. These are just tests. I'm not sure where they're going, but one of the problems I have with projection mapping is if you want to go big scale and if you want to cover large areas, obviously you need a lot of video projectors, and they don't come cheap. And with the light of a laser beam, you have so much more power, brightness condensed into smaller areas that you can, with a single dot, you can light up this tunnel, which is 100 meters long. So I'm experimenting with how can I map the architectural elements with laser beams. This is really simple, but what I love is how a single dot of light just brightens the whole space. Other experiments I wanted to do for years is projection onto water. The idea is simple, but making it happen is so difficult. We tried with mist, fog, falling droplets, and it was a real challenge for me to find the good balance between small atomized particles, but they would still need to fall down to create this kind of layer for projection. I'm struggling at explaining this, but I guess visually that explains better. I also made this interactive, so I have a simple tracking system that allows me to connect the light you see in space and your body. This was the slightly larger experiment we did. This is my silhouette just down there. It's 8 meters by 8 meters. And now it allows me to develop, it will allow me to develop the content and to develop a couple of projects. The problem before was the scale, and yeah, so these are just experiments, but I'd like to explore again the geometry of the cosmos and how we as humans relate to that type of scale. So we're looking for opportunities to develop this project further, and we just need a large space and some time. So that's going to be our goal for the upcoming months.